Hello. So today we're going to work on a top, and this is the one that I've chosen. It's a Butterick, and this view here that has the ruffles on it, that's the one I'm going to be doing. And it looks like it's made very similar to the ones that don't have ruffles. It's just the addition of a ruffle, and why not? Feeling extra. I have this rayon, which is quite tropical, and it's very drapey and should be nice and comfortable. I have pre-washed it. I run it through the washer and the dryer ahead of time, and I can always tell because I pulled this out of my shelf, and I can always tell the ones that I've washed before because I serge the edges just before I throw them in the washer and dryer, and I pull it out and iron it after that. So if I pull it out and it's got the serging on it, I know it's ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and get started cutting these pieces out here, and we'll take it from there. Okay, so right off, I have a dilemma that I need to think about here. And what it is, let me get closer so you can see. This comes pretty straight around the hips. If you can see, it's like it comes straight down. It doesn't have a big floofy flare at the bottom. And my body type is kind of hourglassy but heavy on the hips. And if I have something that's coming straight down like this, in a standard size to fit up here, it's going to really be snugging around my hips. Now, I don't want to cut everything in a very large size because I want to make sure that my shoulders are going to line up right. But I want to give you a heads up to really look at the pattern. You can kind of see on this one where it's just straight down. It just looks really narrow to me. This is the pattern piece for the back. The front is a little awkward because it has like the big overlap thing, so it's easier to gauge it on the back. And you can see if up here is the shoulder, it comes pretty much straight down. It doesn't flare out. So just look at the pattern, figure out your body type, and go from there. So I have just measured, I'm wearing here, let me tip this up here. So just to give you an idea here, thanks for staring at my hips and everything, but I'm wrapping this around my skirt because I figure this blouse I'm going to be wearing untucked over something else. So I'm measuring over something else, which is my patchwork skirt today. So what I'm doing is just giving myself, with my tape measure, a feel of where I want to. Now, 45 is going to go around me. Yes, it is. But I want it a little bit fuller. I think at about 48, I'm going to have enough ease and enough everything that I'll feel more comfortable. So that means I'm going to need to add 3 inches to my pattern. So 3 inches means 1.5 inches on each side. And because that is doubled when you are actually working on your pattern, that's going to be adding 3/4 of an inch to each side. And what I'm going to do is just kind of add that, start it here, and just kind of taper it all the way up. All right, so this is going to be really quick. Since I haven't cut the tissue paper out yet, I'm just going to go ahead and modify this pattern so it's done once and for all. So what I've done is I've taken my back piece, and this is my front piece, and I am laying it so that the lines for the size that I'm cutting out I'm going to pin them so they are exactly on top of each other, and that their little register marks match up here. Just put a couple little pins here just to make sure everybody's together. Because whatever I do to one, I want to do to the other one exactly, so that when I sew them together, they'll be on track, so I might as well do it at the same time. This little thing here, it's a flexible ruler, you know, it bends, it's lovely. What I'm going to do is kind of form it to the shape of this side seam, okay? So actually I want to form it from the bottom because that's where I'm going to have more. And it's a very straight seam. It's not a lot. Okay, so I have my ruler pretty much lined up on my side seam. I'm also going to go ahead and mark, because I want to extend this 3/4 of an inch. So that is right here. I think I picked a pin that doesn't work too well. So what I'm going to do is line up this ruler that I have now formed to the right shape and just kind of reposition it. And from the point that it leaves the original cutting line, which is right about here, I'm just swooping it out so it's a nice gentle curve. Okay, so now I can come back and with the front and back line pinned together so nobody's moving, I can just go ahead and cut my new cutting line, and I can just proceed as normal with everything else. So anyway, you know, that's just what I'm doing. If you need to take it in, it's the same thing where you just move part of it in. If you need to just add a little bit for the waist, well, just, you know, add some for the waist and smooth it out. So before you cut your actual size is a good time to evaluate what you need to do. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is work on this front bodice piece. And rayon being what it is just not sitting still, so I can tell it's going to be fun. Every time I think I have it smoothed out perfectly, it pooches out somewhere, but we're okay. We're okay. Now, in the pattern, what it wants you to do is go straight to gathering this. There's some little circles up here I'll punch, and they want you to gather up. But for me, because rayon being rayon and fabric in general being fabric in general, this is a very long swoop that's cut on a bias. So I am going to take these pieces, well, actually, first I'm going to mark all the markings. Then I'm going to take these pieces to my ironing board, and I'm going to fuse some of my woven stay tape along this edge on both the right and left side, just so there is no chance that this is going to stretch out of shape before I get a chance to sew anything together. Okay, so this is how I punch my circles, other markings. Actually, on this piece, this is printed extremely lightly and my fabric is very loud, but there are buttonhole placements on here. I am not going to put those on right now. I'm going to wait until after everything is sewed, and then I'll transfer those buttonhole markings just before I put the buttonholes on. I don't want to worry about those getting skewed or out of shape or anything at this point. Okay, so I was just about to explain how I punch my holes, mark it with my heat erasable pen, and everything for my holes. But what do you see here? Do you see my big mark? Because this fabric is so loud, my marks are going to disappear. So because of that, I will be using an alternative marking method, which is going back to paper tape. And I buy these, they come in a pack of several different colors. So instead of relying on me being able to find my little mark on an extremely loud fabric, I'm just going to be putting little pieces of tape. And I tried to find a color that was not part of the print of this fabric, and bright red was the closest I could find. So I'm just going to be putting little pieces of tape where my circles are, because that way I can for sure see them. Alright, so I'm actually going to be trying out a different tape today. I've been trying to find an alternative to that Soak Easy because it is so expensive. And this stuff This is like a trial run, so we'll see how it goes. This is something I got out of this Wawak catalog on page 79, and it feels similar. It's woven-ish, but it's a tricot, and it kind of gives a little side to side, but not so much lengthwise. So this way it's pretty firm. This way, not so much. But I think it's worth a shot because a big roll of this stuff is about $5, whereas it's $12 for a little roll of the other. So we're going to give it a shot and see how it does on this garment. So this will be our test run. So I am just pressing it, putting a little bit on. Go to the next place. Oops, there goes my catalog. Put a little on. And working my way up around this curve all the way up. Okay, so with this done, I can tell you it molds to curves really well because the sides do give a bit. So it does mold to curves. It does seem to help not wanting it to stretch. Now, it's not as ironclad as the purely woven because that will not stretch. This has a tiny bit, but it is enough stability that I think it's going to do what I need. The other thing that I'm kind of liking right now is this is 1 inch wide. The Soak Easy is just 1/2 inch. So for something like this, it's very soft, it's very supple, and when you're sewing over it, you're sewing with the reinforcement, where with the other one, you have to stagger it out in order to be able to sew over that tape. So, you know, I think that they both have their purpose, but for this, where I want to maintain the shape, but it's not as important that it's going to be under a lot of strain. It's just under drape. So I think it's going to be fine for right here. So what I'm going to do, this being rayon, I'm going to lightly serge, and lightly I mean I'm just going at the edge. I'm not trying not to trim anything off, but I'm going to be going and serging around the edges, and I'm going to serge over my tapes. I have my tapes just bent over. The stitches will go over it. All right, so I have serged around this edge, and I have to tell you, if you've ever worked with funky rayon, you know what a pain it can be. It frays easily, it moves easily. If you're trying to sew something that's pretty heavy on it, it's going to pull wonky. And I think that this stuff is actually going to help a lot. So while I have this flat, I'm going to go ahead and put the same stuff around the armband, because that's where there's going to be a lot of stress, is when you're moving your arm and pulling. So I want this to be nice and supported. And I can tell that I don't see it through on this side, and it's lovely. So I'm going to go ahead and do the armbands. Then up here between my 2 pieces of tape, I am going to put a couple rows of gathering stitches, and I'm just using regular thread. This is a very short space. I don't need to put in my heavy-duty gathering thread that I put in my bobbin when I'm doing long pieces. But I just wanted to show you that this is going to be a good thing, I think, for this particular fabric and this particular blouse. So I'm going to go ahead and put it around this armhole and the probably the back armholes also. All right, so I'm ready to get started with the back piece. Now I just want to give you one more close-up here, since we're playing Test Kitchen in the sewing room today with this tape. This is the drapey part in the front, that front opening. Okay, now around the armbands where I put the tape, on this arm I just kind of shaped it around. Okay, on this arm here I stretched it. So I actually had it here, and then I just kind of pulled it tighter to stretch it as it came around, just to see what would happen, to see the difference. They both worked okay, but I can tell you where I stretched it, it's much more secure. It's much more like a stay stitch, whereas where I did not stretch it, there is a little bit of give, not very much, but just a tiny bit if I really put pressure on it. So that could be a difference when you're applying it if you wanted to. If this is something you're interested in, this is the company again where I ordered it, and that's their website. That's their website, thewawak.com. And what it is here. It is their fusible tricot tape. That's their item number if you're going to order it. And it is the 1 inch by 50 yards that I purchased, which was $5.65 at this point. They have it in different widths and things like that, but you know, always just looking for new stuff, and I think it's pretty good. So, moving to the back piece now, I'm going to punch the holes and mark where the tie goes up here. There's a couple of circles here for sleeve placement, and a couple up here for where that shoulder gathers are going to be attaching here. Then there's a triangle. On Butterick, they mark your shoulder, the top of your shoulder, with a triangle. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this also. There's nothing that joins there. Wherever there's a circle, that means two things are meeting up there. But there's a triangle, that's strictly placement. And that's marking your shoulder. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that too, just so when I'm putting it on my dress form and things like that, I can make sure everything's lining up right. Okay, so I probably should clarify something here. See, I put all my tape all the way up. I put it here because this is where all those gathers are going to be sewn onto, and I wanted it a little more stabilized. And I did the armhole. Now, this is it's rayon. It's rayon, and it doesn't want to behave well, okay? And that's the reason why I did this. If this was another type of fabric, if it was a typical woven that's going to behave itself and it's got some structure to it, I would not be doing all of this. I would be reinforcing the necklines and in the front, that big drapey part, that crossover part in the front. But no, I would not be doing this. But this is just because of this type of fabric. You ever get to the point where you just don't want to deal with a misbehaving fabric, so you just start off putting limits on it? That's what this is. So, with that said, I do, if you can tell, you can't see that tape through this. One, because it's so busy, and also because since it's the rayon, it's a little more opaque than a super sheer lightweight fabric. So I'm going to go ahead right now, and I'm pinning these on here. I have my gathering stitches put in, and we are gathering between the two circles, which in my case look like little pieces of red tape. And once I have these pulled, and I do the 2 rows of gathering stitches, it's just going to help it lay better. If you do just 1 row of gathering stitches, they tend to bunch up a little bit wonky. And again, just don't want to deal with that. Now, when I was sewing this, I sewed it face down, so I know that my bobbin thread was actually the one on the good side. So I am going to, as soon as I fix this one little crossed over part here. Okay, so I am pulling the bobbin threads. That's the easier thread to pull when you're dealing with your gathers. It just pulls smoother for some reason. So I pull it nice and tight. Once it's the right, what would we call, quantity of gathers, then I kind of smush them around and distribute them better. Okay, but then I'm going to come back and sew across here at a 5/8 inch seam allowance, straight across. Right here is my 5/8 inch seam. Now they want you to make a second seam a 1/4 inch away, and then they want you to trim close to this one. So just on the outside of that 1/4 inch seam, we're going to trim it. They actually wanted you to baste the gathered section onto the back section before you stitched it. I skipped that part. I didn't think that I really needed to worry about that, but anyway, so this is what it's going to look like once you trim it. And then we're going to be pressing this seam allowance towards the back, all right, this way. I'm sewing together the side seams. This is the back that I'm looking at. On the instructions, it's this part. Now you can see on this side, it's just a seam all the way up, okay? On this side, you go up to the first dot and stop, and then start at the next one and finish it, okay? So The tapes on this side were kind of pointless. I can just pull those off, but on this side, those are the ones that are marking my 2 dots. So I'm sewing here and here. I was actually just about to sew, and I realized I said something that I need to clarify here. I said you go here to here and here to here. So technically, what you're always supposed to do is start sewing at the topmost part of the seam and work your way down. And the reason for that is that if something happens and you end up with a little bit extra fabric or something, down at the bottom it's okay because that's like the ends, it's the hemline, it's whatever, and you can just even it out. But if you do that like part up way, so you get part of it up here and part of it there or something, that could cause problems. So even though I said this and then this, in general, and there's always exceptions, but in general, you always start at the uppermost part of the seam and work your way down. And if it's like pants or a skirt or something, still you start up at the waistband and work your way down instead of the bottom and working your way up. So just wanted to clarify that. It was bothering me, so now I'm going to go sew this. Oh, and another thing I do, you don't have to, this is just me. When I'm coming to a place that I have to stop, either I put 2 pins or I put my pins the opposite way. So you can see, usually I have it so I can just pull my little heads out here. But where my stops are, I have them the opposite way. So I know when I get there, my mind's going to trigger me to stop. So with that sewn, I am now just tucking in. This is my little opening here, okay? And I am just tucking the edges of that seam allowance underneath where that opening is. Putting little pins at the top and bottom of my tape markings so that I can know where to start and where to stop. And I'm just going to run a little straight stitch right along here just to keep that nice and flat. Alright, so this is what she looks like right now, and you can see that I've got enough ease down here around the hips that I can feel comfortable with that. And up here where I have my shoulder marks, when I put those on the top of the shoulders, my side seam lines up nice and straight down. There's my little opening. So I think everything's good so far. So the next thing we're going to do is the ruffle, actually, in the front. We need to get started on the ruffle. If you're doing the view without the ruffle, just skip this part. But what I need to do is transfer all these markings. So I've got notches, I've got circles. This little triangle here should be the top of my shoulder, which will match up to the same location as the shoulder mark on my blouse. And here is the center back that will be sewn. Now the first thing it's going to want you to do, after you transfer the markings, of course, and I'm going to be using my tape again just because this pattern is so busy. I wouldn't be able to see a little pin mark. But the first thing you need to do is reinforce this inner edge. You can stay stitch it, but since today's program is all about using that tricot tape, I'm going to actually use the tricot tape on here also. And that's just going to stabilize this because this is the part that gets sewn onto the blouse. So when it opens up flat like this, you get the real pretty ruffle, okay? But I need to make sure that this does not stretch because if it stretches, it's not going to fit onto the blouse. Okay, so I have my tape fused all the way around, and I've just formed it. I didn't stretch it this time, I just formed it. So there's tiny little pleats, but those are pressed, they're fused, and I think it's going to hold nicely. So I'm going to go ahead and match up and stitch this center seam. And you know what, since it's going to be kind of exposed, I'm actually going to be doing a French seam on this center seam, just because if the ruffle flops up, I want it to still look nice for this center back seam of the ruffle. So what I'm doing is I'm putting the wrong sides together with the right sides together on the outside. And I'm going to be doing a 1/4 inch seam down the back. And then I'll be trimming it down to 1/8 of an inch. But it's a lot easier to sew a 1/4 inch and trim it than to get an accurate 1/8 inch. So that's why I do what I do. Okay, so here is my 1/4 inch seam. And what I'm going to do is come back and basically cut that seam allowance in half. So I'm going to end up, my hands over here, end up with about an 1/8 inch seam allowance. And then I will press this first. Okay, so then I'm going to press this. First I'll just press it open, and then I'll fold it over and press it flat. Okay, and once I have it pressed like that so it's nice and flat, then I'll come back and I'll do another seam here with another 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so now I have my enclosed French seam in the back. I pressed it flat again after I sewed it. So that way, if my ruffle flops up and everything, it's going to be nice and pretty. No chance of anything fraying because rayon frays like crazy. So enclosing that seam's a good thing. Now the next thing I need to do is hem this outer edge, which has a very extreme curve. Okay, what the instructions say is to stitch a 1/4 inch and then pull that thread. So basically easing in with that thread, which is basically kind of what I do when I do my finger thing. And one of you guys said that that's called crimping, which is a good word. I like that word, crimping. My old bishop book, hang on a second, let me get it. Don't know if any of you old school sewers like me remember this book, but this book called it Stay Stitch Plus. And Nancy Zeman called it something else, but crimping is a whole lot easier. So we're going to go with crimping. So with the crimping thing, what I'm going to be doing is sewing a stitch a 1/4 inch in, but instead of just sewing it and then pulling it, I'm going to do that thing where you put your finger behind the presser foot. So let me show you how that works. So I got the fabric under my presser foot, and I'm lining it up along the outside edge of my presser foot because that's a 1/4 inch guide for me. I'm going to get a couple stitch started just so I get the fabric to the outside. Okay, so now the fabric is starting to poke through the back of my presser foot. Putting this finger behind my foot and pressing it towards the foot and down towards the plate. I'm just going to let it run until it gets bulky and then let it go. And see how that puts a slight gather in here. Let me do it some more. Okay. So this is what it looks like close up. And you can see, hopefully, that there's just a little bit of gather worked in there. Not enough that it's going to pucker, but just enough that it's going to make it easy to fold. So if I folded that in and up, this up here is gathered enough that I can just tuck in and go because I'll have my curve worked in. Okay, so starting at the center back, I turned it under. I'm working so that my stitching line here is at the top of my fold. So I'm tucking in everything above that stitching line, and then at about a 1/4 inch, that's where I'm just going to use my little clips on here and just clip it. Okay, so I'm tucking it in at the seam line or the stitching line, and then just put a little clip. And what that does is it works the curve in nice and easy all the way around. And then once I have it clipped, I'm actually going to stitch it before I press it. Okay, so I have the ruffle fully prepared now. That tape there marks my center front dot. These little tapes mark my shoulders. Of course, I have my center back as a seam. So on the inside, you can see the way that we did the hem on it makes it nice, flat, no puckers. And so I really, really recommend doing the hem that way. And then the very inside part, and this is the part I'm going to be stitching over, I have my tricot tape on there. And that's still doing a very good job holding it secure. So now I'm going to be pinning the ruffle onto my blouse, and it's right side up for the ruffle and right side up for the blouse. The tip of the ruffle just comes to the edge of the fabric, and then we're going to be matching up that shoulder point we marked on here. I have with my tape, and my tape actually came off, so I have a pin up here. So I'm going to match up my shoulder point, my center back, the other shoulder, and so on. And once I have it all pinned here, we're going to come back with a needle and thread and just hand baste it on all the way across. And that way it's going to be held on nice and securely while we're working on the facing, but we don't have to deal with several layers of pins in there. Okay, so with that done, the next thing we need to work on are these little straps. So we cut 2 big long pieces for those ties, and what I'm going to be doing is folding them in half this way, okay, all the way up, while sewing it all the way up here, making sure I pivot and come here, and then I'll be turning them right side out. Okay, so I've got it sewn, and I am taking off some of the bulk at the pointed parts here so that I can turn it. Now I'm going to be using this for my turner today. And what you do, a piece of tape, is there's a pointy side and a rounded side. I put it onto the rounded side and pull it all the way on. Close it up and transfer it to the other side. Okay, then open it up, and there you go. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and press this flat so it's a nice flat tie. Okay, so here is the end of my strap. The very beginning of it is at an angle. So we're going to put the longer tip at the top. And in the directions, it does not show this part of it for the view with the ruffle. Okay, where are we? Here we are. It just shows it as if the ruffle is not there. And these little dots are high enough that they are going to be in the same position as the ruffles. So if you can see right here, here's my 2 dots. Well, they're tapes, but there's my 2 dots. Here's my ruffle. So I'm just going to place this on top and hope for the best. If I put this here and then we're going to have a facing that sews on top of it here and here, so this can come out like this if it's placed on top. If it goes underneath the ruffle, I'm concerned that if I go like that, then when it pulls, it's going to maybe catch part of this ruffle, and I don't want that. So when I'm placing it, I am just placing it over those 2 dots, and I am just laying the strap on top of my ruffle, if that helps. So I'm going to just put a little stitch right here, probably about 1/4 inch in, just to hold it in place until we get to the next step. All right, so I did actually film when I put the interfacing on, or at least I thought I did, but I didn't. The camera wasn't right. The camera was not set right. So anyhow, I have fused my very, very lightweight interfacing to my front facing piece and my back piece. Now in the back, after I fused my interfacing to it, I marked the center back point, and I marked where that shoulder point is. That is this little triangle. The tip of that triangle is my shoulder point, just so I can make sure it lines up right with the other piece, with the shoulder piece. Everything else is pretty self-explanatory. On the very tip, there's a couple circles, but those circles just mark where the sash goes, and we know where the sash goes because it's already on, so I'm skipping that for right now. After I have this sewn, I came back and I serged the outside edge, and that just cleaned up any little piece of interfacing that might have been sticking out. made sure that it's nice and bound so it's not going to fray on me, because this stuff can fray. Now I'm ready to go ahead and pin this onto the blouse, and that's why we hand basted the ruffle on before, because this is going to sit right on top of that, and that way it'll be nice and smooth. Okay, so this is my facing, and I am matching up the, here I am, the center back to where that seam is on my ruffle. That marks the center back. And I had a piece of tape right here for my shoulder seam. Let me see. It's still there on this side. So you can see where the little piece of tape here is for my shoulder seam on this side, and I'm matching that up with this mark on my facing. And that way I know everything is where it's supposed to be there. So I'm going to put a little pin there. And then let me get all the way down to the bottom here. And this is where we have the ruffle and the little sash that we sewed on at 1/4 inch. Let me cut this little tail off. Oh my gosh, I think I've magnetized all my pins. They just want to jump everywhere today. Okay, so I'm just going to place this on top of the sash and the ruffle. So I'm going to stick a pin right here going down, and right here coming over. Now if you want a guide so that you can make sure that you make this curve exact, just mark out 5/8 each way. So here's 5/8 coming this way. I'm sorry about that. Put another one here and draw that line. And then coming down this direction, mark 5/8 here and here. And that's just going to give you a nice guideline to follow as you're stitching to see exactly where you're going to need to make that curve. And that's kind of important on this blouse because we have, well here, I'm going to stick a pin right in that point and we'll see how it turns out here. If it's right here, and I make that curve coming down, so I'm putting my pin where my stitches would be. It's going to be this way so that when it comes out to the very top of this sash is going to be where that point is. And that's why you want to make it pretty close to being accurate there. Okay? Okay, so I've sewn this, and now what I'm going to do is take some of the bulk out of the corner, and I'm cutting it so that I'm about 1/8 of an inch away from that corner. And then I'm going to also slip my scissors in here and cut off most of the bulk of the interfaced part on this side and up here. Just for a little bit, for like maybe 1 inch or so. Okay, so it looks kind of like that. Then we're going to turn it and hope for the best. Let's see here. Here's my chopstick that I use so often. See if I can poke this corner, what happens. And yay, so my corner turned out right, where my strap comes this way, my ruffle goes that way, and everything is good. Now I'll be understitching it. But if you got to this point and you pulled it out and this wasn't perfect, say you pulled it and this had gotten up a little bit, which is very easy to do, I know, because that's what happened to me on this side. When I opened it, it was about 2 stitches in. So let me show you what I did. One, you can either just leave it, because honestly, who's going to know and who's going to care but you? Or I went back in and picked out just a couple stitches up here and folded that little piece of strap over, sewed those stitches back, and so when I open it, it's all good. Okay, it just has a little bit of a fold, but you know, nobody's going to notice that for sure. So, you know, it happens. They don't give you really any wiggle room with this pattern, so either it's perfect it's not, or you can live with it, and that's pretty much your options there. So now it's time to understitch this. I've got a lot of layers here. I have the blouse layer, a ruffle layer, and an interfaced facing layer. And they are all fairly thin. But this blouse layer that's the furthest in, it has the serging on it. And just to grade this just a little bit, I'm going to be trimming that layer down about halfway through that seam allowance, so it's 1/4 inch. These other two I'm just going to leave as is. Okay, so with that done, I think that's enough that when I fold it in, it's going to stagger it enough that I'm not going to have a huge, obvious chunk down where all the seam allowances end, okay? The only other thing that I might want to trim is where this French seam in the back of the ruffle is. I think I'll take that down just a little bit. No one's going to see the back underneath your ruffle, but just for my peace of mind. So now it's time to understitch. Okay. So for starting from this side, you're going to pull all these seam allowances towards the facing. And let's see here. This here, that's my stitching line. So we'll be running a line of stitching about 1/8 of an inch in. So if that's my stitching line, we'll be putting it in there all the way around, you know, starting, don't stretch your garment out of shape trying to get to the corner, but where it's comfortable, start it there and go all the way around the whole facing, and that'll make it a nicer edge when you turn it. Okay, so this is my understitch line here. Now when you're sewing it, be really careful that you don't catch your ruffle in. Every time you move the fabric, just double check and push your ruffle aside because it's going to want to scoot in there. So now that I have that done, before I press it along this whole back neck area where there's a lot of curve, I'm going to come back and clip up to where that understitching line is. So if I open it up here, I'm just going to put clips, you know, every inch or so all the way around, and that's going to help that neck edge to lay nice and flat. So I would say that I would start it, just here's your seam where you sewed the front piece to the back piece. I'd start it maybe a couple inches before that and work it all the way around. Okay, so now I have ironed it so that the edge is nice and pressed. So this is my ruffle, okay? And if you can see here, so underneath here you can see my understitching, how that's pulling it so that at the very edge it's all reaching towards the inside. So from the outside you don't see any stitches, you don't see anything, it's just a nice smooth fold there, which is what you want. Now, we need to secure the spacing so it's not going to poke up. And I am going to put one of my labels in the back and just tack that down, you know, keeping the ruffle free, of course. I'm just going to tack that down. That'll tack it there. On the sides, the facing, there's a seam in the facing here, and that matches up with the seam where we sewed the front to the back piece. Remember with those gathers? So that matches up there. And then there's this really, really long stretch down to where the tie is. And all of this, that just looks like it wants to pooch up to me. So what I'm going to do is actually come back and really quickly hand stitch this down. My stitches are going to be invisible because the ruffle is hiding them. So I'm not too worried about that. I'm just going to stitch it down so that way I don't have to worry about this wanting to curl up when I wash it or when I'm wearing it or something like that. And it won't take that long. So we are to the last piece of this puzzle, which is the sleeve. As you can see, rayon is doing what rayon does, and even though I thought I cut this out perfectly, the fabric is pooching out. But since this is a gathered sleeve, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to assume that everything's going to work itself out in the wash. I'm punching out the circles for where my marks are going to go, and I'm just going to put a little dot here because this is actually at a point where I can see. I'm tired of using my tape, so I'm going to put a dot and a line, and I think that I'll be able to see that just fine. So I'm going to do that for all 3 dots. I'm going to be After I have it marked, I will serge around the edge of each sleeve piece, and then between these two outside dots, I'm going to be running 2 rows of gathering stitches. So I'm going to do that for both sleeves, making sure that I mark which side is the back, and the side with more notches is always the back. But I'm actually going to put a piece of, I just said I'm tired of tape. I'm going to be putting a piece of tape on the back. That way I know for sure which side is which, because a lot of these pieces tend to look very, very similar. All right, so you can see I have my gathering thread sewn in, and it's serged around the whole side. So what I need to do is sew this seam here, the underarm seam, on both of the pieces, on both sleeves, sewing it as standard 5/8, and then pressing this seam open. Okay, so I have this seam done and pressed open. Now in the instructions they have an interesting way of making the narrow hem along this bottom edge. So we're going to go with it. What they want you to do is sew a seam 1/2 inch in all the way around. Okay? And once you get that seam sewn, then they want you to come back and trim it. Well, no, I take that back. You sew the seam, and then they're going to have you press it at that seam so that the stitching is just barely on the inside here. And after you have that, then they want you to trim it close. All right, so I sewed that stitch line at about 1/2 inch, and then came back and I trimmed it. You can see I trimmed it pretty close. I got about 1/8 of an inch from that stitch line I trimmed. And then pressed it so that the stitches are just inside. Actually, I pressed it first and then trimmed it. It's a lot easier to do it that way. Press it first and then trim it. Then, after I did that, I folded it over again so that now I have a very nice firm hem, a narrow hem, all the way around. Now, if it was me and I was not following the instructions, or at least trying to, I might just use a rolled hem foot and whiz all the way around here and make up a narrow hem myself. But not everyone likes to use a rolled hem foot, and this is a pretty decent option, and having that row of stitching does hold it nice and secure. So what I'm going to be doing is coming back and putting a row of stitching pretty close to this edge all the way around. All right, and so now the instructions want us to use a 1/2 inch single fold bias tape to make an elastic casing. So I've got some here, and this is going to make an extremely narrow casing. So if you're going to be using any wider elastic, or you just don't want to deal with something this narrow, you might want to get a wider bias tape. But anyway, what we're going to do is I'm going to pin it so that it's about 1/8 of an inch spacing between the top of the hem and the bottom of my bias tape. It'll give it a little bit of a ruffly effect. It looks like that's what they're calling for. So let's say I start this here with a raw edge right there. I'm going to come all the way around and just trim it. When I get to this point, I'll sew it to that point and leave this flapping. All right, and then I will put my elastic in. After the elastic is nice and settled in and everybody is happy, then I can fold this over, tuck it under, and just hand stitch that down, and it'll have a nice finish in here. So, but for right now, I'm just going to start here and I'm going to end here with just this top part flapping off. Alright, so the pattern comes with a guide for elastic, so I've cut my elastic to that. I'm using a 1/4 inch elastic. I actually tried this with a narrower one, but it just wasn't strong enough to hold this in. It was too wimpy, I guess you would say, so it wasn't doing its job that elastic should. So I'm using this 1/4 inch one, and because this casing is so narrow, I'm not even going to try to use my bodkin. I'm just going to use a big fat yarn needle. So what I'm doing is I pull it through about 1/2 inch, and then I'm going to put a couple little stitches through here to tag it on without creating even more bulk. And then I can just pull those stitches out as soon as I get it around to the other side. Pushing it through the whole casing. Get it started. There it goes. Now, before this part wants to sneak in, I'm going to just get a straight pin and pin it over here to my seam allowance just to keep it from wanting to disappear on me. Alrighty, so I have it pulled out all the way here. So I'm going to go ahead and take my needle off of here, sew these two pieces of elastic together. I'm just going to overlap it and stitch them together so that try to make them as narrow as possible. At this point, I have the elastic. It's been stitched together. I've gone like that, got it settled back in. So now I have to deal with my little flap. And what I'm going to do is cut it about 1 inch overlap here. Tuck in the end here. There we go. And pin it down really quick, and then I'm just going to hand stitch a few stitches to keep that nice and down. And then this part of the bottom of the sleeves will be done, and then we can start working on setting them into the blouse on top. Alright, so now what you're looking at is an armhole. The bottom of it's here, this is the top, here's my ruffle, I just fluffed up out of the way. What I'm going to be doing is setting the arm or the sleeve into it. So I have my bottom seam, and remember on my sleeve itself I put a piece of tape on the back. So that way it's easy for me to say, okay, this is the front of my blouse, this is the back, this sleeve has a tape in the back, so it's obviously this one that goes on this side. And so I'm going to go ahead and pin it, matching the bottom, matching the center tops, matching the two side positions. And then after I have that all matched up, and then I'll come back and pull some of the gathering threads to try to make it all fit. Okay, so I have my sleeve pinned in, and you can see up here at the top, all of that gathering just fits in that little bitty area up at the top. Now, I had reinforced the armhole on my bodice part, but I did not do it on the sleeve itself, and you can see that the sleeve itself has actually stretched out of shape some. So, as rayon does, but I'm not going to stress about that too much. As I sew it, I'm going to ease this extra in, so that's not a big deal to me. I just wanted to show you that this stuff is actually doing what I intended it for it to do, and if I was sewing this again with rayon, with a fabric that is as pesky as rayon is again, I would be tempted to go ahead and fuse some of this up to the very top edge of that sleeve also, just to keep it from getting out of whack. So anyhow, that's just a thought as I'm going through this. I'm going to go ahead and sew these two sleeves on, and I'll be right back. So I have sewn the sleeve on, and I wanted to show you, this is my first seam, and then I came back and I sewed a second one. And I didn't do it the whole way around, but I did it from about this point on each side. So that whole lower edge where most of the strain is going to be, that's where it is. So now I'm leaving the top part alone, but where I have it double stitched, which is starting right about here, I am going to trim it just to make it a little more comfortable, to make that armhole easier to wear. Need to get new pinking shears at some point, I think. But that is what I'm doing there. So now after this, the last thing that we have to do is just hem up at the very bottom of our blouse. Alright, so for the hem, this is where our tie is here, and we still have this part that's open. So what I've done is I've pressed this at the 5/8, and this side here I've pressed at the 5/8. And it's just going to be a narrow hem, and that's what they call for in the instructions. But instead of having a really lumpy corner, by doing that, I have a crosshatch point, and I'm just going to fold that corner up so the edge is at that point, so that then I can have a nice little mitered corner here. So now that I have that just kind of finger pressed, I'm going to go ahead and pin this little miter down in place so that when my needle gets to that point, because I'm just going to do a straight stitch to hem this. I was thinking about doing a double turn where I turn it down twice, but I want the bottom of this to stay nice and flowy, and I think a double turn might give it a little bit more stiffness that I'm looking for, and hopefully no one's going to see the inside. So anyway, I'm going to do this same type of thing on the opposite corner and just do a straight stitch fairly close to the edge, so right along this edge. That's where I'm going to be sewing. That way it won't pull out at all, but it'll be still fairly close to the edge. Alright, so almost done. Now remember at the very beginning I told you I was not transferring those buttonhole marks over, and that is because I wanted to make sure that wherever this intersection came, from this side overlapping this side, that I was able to put some kind of a secure right there. Because every body is shaped different, that point can fluctuate based on your shoulder height, the size of your chest, whether your chest is, super young or been around for a while. You know what I mean? So I wanted to try it on, so I just did. I just kind of put it over my dress, but I think I got a good enough idea. So I marked the location where I'm going to need to put the snap. So on this side of this one and this side of this one, that's where I'm going to put my little snap. And I'm going to sew it on so it's not visible from the outside, which is pretty easy because I have this whole ruffle that I can camouflage it with. But I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then it'll be done. So I think it turned out really nice, and the rayon fabric, it feels very fabulous to wear. And it's a love-hate thing with rayon because it is kind of difficult to work with because it doesn't want to behave. It wants to shift, it wants to stretch, it wants to fray. But I think using that tricot tape wherever there is a seam that's going to have any kind of structure or tension on it worked really well. I really, really like the way that turned out. And actually the only seam that got stretched out of shape was on the sleeve where I did not use it. So there you go. I think that if I was to do it again, I might do this elastic on the cuffs a little bit different. I mean, it's cute. It's got like the little ruffly thing and everything, but I think that I'd rather not have that ruffle. You know, this feels more, even though it's a ruffly top, it feels like it should be more sophisticated than a little ruffle on the cuffs. So I think I would do that a little bit different. But that is so minor. Honestly, that is so minor. It's very comfortable. And I bent over so you can see, because I was concerned with it being just a wrap and only having that one little snap, if that would give me enough coverage. And I think it does, you know, because it's the belt that's going to hold the brunt of it together. Now, if you're worried, you could always put a secondary button on over here, or you could, you know, tie your belt in a knot instead of a bow or something so that you could feel secure it's not going to come undone. But other than that, I think it's a great pattern. Just be aware when you're first cutting it out, when you're cutting that back piece, you'll get a really good idea of the dimensions of the bodice part, of the hip and the waist and the bust. You know, it's all laid out there on that back piece. And if you think that your body type is going to need a little more or a little less somewhere, make that adjustment then, because from that point on, everything went well. So I hope you liked it. I think that it turned out really good. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Living my bucolic life, free of big city strife. Horses, chicks, and dogs, they are my neighbors. I cook and some spin, and move the horses into the barn. Then time to move them out again. Red barns, green pastures, beautiful white houses. The view I see each day when I arise. This life pleases me, as it is plain to see. I'm living my bucolic life.